Zuko repeats the refrain that Azula always lies. But of course that's not altogether true. She doesn't always lie. But she is always alone. And people do not trust her. And those two facts are inevitably intertwined. She is always alone. She can always only ever be alone because no one else trusts her and she does not trust anyone else. She does not, in fact, always lie, but people always fear that she can be. She will lie whenever she believes that it is in her practical best interest to do so. She has no desires, no ideology beyond merely serving the Fire Nation via dominating all of those she believes to be her enemies, and even dominating those she believes to be her friends. For Azula, all relationships are about power. They are about domination. They are about control. She does not believe in love or trust or a sense of community. She does not believe in the vision of people united together in a common interest that is not merely practical or self-serving. She has no relationships that are in what Aristotle considers the highest quality of friendship, which is a relationship founded on the mutual and beneficial good on both parties. That does not mean that people constantly recite platitudes of moral virtue to each other. It does mean that the relationship is beneficial to both. It nourishes the best qualities of both parties and ameliorates the worst. It is fundamentally founded on a philosophical ground, even if it is not necessarily perceived in that rigid a light. The relationships between the members of Team Avatar is a great example of this. They're not going around thinking, using all my philosophical insight, how does this relationship benefit me? But they do think, am I good with this person? Do we work well together? Are they good for me? Am I good for them? Do we make each other better, more courageous, more thoughtful? They do think along these lines, and that's more what Aristotle is talking about. Azula doesn't even have a lot of relationships of what Aristotle considers the second highest quality, the medium quality friendships, which are those founded on mutual pleasure and delight, people who just like to be together, like to spend time together, who enjoy spending time together, even if doing so does not necessarily make them more thoughtful or more open or more compassionate people. Azula's relationships are merely practical. They are merely transactional. She is unable and unwilling to consider relationships through any other light. She believes that others will betray her when they have the chance. She believes others view the world the same as she does. That is, as this harsh Hobbesian world where everything is about power. For Hobbes, the world is not as simply brutal as I think a lot of high school depictions of Hobbes make him out to be. He does not believe people are innately vile and will destroy each other the first chance they get. That's not the point. The point is that people ultimately have burning desires that conflict with what others want and what is best for the group as a whole. We know these desires. Sex, power, wealth. People have these desires. And inevitably, especially in a world where there is a limited amount of resources, people will be propelled by these desires to secure their own advantage. And that inevitably means conflicting with other people who also want the same things, and thus leading to a world of strife and suffering, which does have a pretty significant historical record of happening, especially in the absence of an authority, a government, to act in the best interests of the people. Hobbes ultimately views a strong authority as necessary for quieting social strife, for creating a sense of order that inevitably will not exist if people are merely left to their conflicting and burning desires for status, for eros, for wealth, that inevitably conflict with each other. But of course, that's not all society is. It is not only about power and force. Even if you are extremely cynical about the idea of a centralized government, or even any kind of government at all that has the responsibility to set laws and restrictions in the best interest of the people to keep them from destroying each other and maintain a sense of order and shared prosperity, even if you're extremely libertarian or anarchist and you do believe that the state is inevitably about power. I really hope you don't just believe that human relationships are about power. Certainly, it's good to talk about power dynamics and relationships of all kinds, but that's not all relationships are. But that is all they are for Azula. There is no sense of community or commonality between people. There is no sense of individuals being able to act in concert to put aside their own selfish desires and ultimately act in ways that will benefit them both. There is no sentiment in Azula's world. There is no trust. There is no compassion. There is no moral framework except that of people's interests are inevitably opposed to each other, which in some instances they are, and people will inevitably pursue those interests at all cost and ignore all other factors, all other values, all other belief systems in their pursuit of those interests, which is a rather cynical way of seeing the world. And this is why no one trusts her. I think back to Zuko Alone, episode 207, which is when we first have the Azula always lies line. And in the first instance where we see Zuko repeating that, he is referring to an instance where Azula did not lie. She was telling him that his father was planning to kill him, which he was. Arguably, Ursa learns about Ozai's plan from overhearing Azula. What Azula says in this instance is not a lie, and it is arguably even beneficial that Zuko knows this when he's young, as traumatic as it is. There's also that little similar instance that happens in Season 3 when Azula discovers that Zuko went to see his uncle, Iroh, in prison. Azula playfully extracts that information from him, but she says that she doesn't have an ulterior motive in that instance, and the show provides no reason to believe otherwise. She never uses that information against him. Azula is not solely cruel and callous. The beach, of course, demonstrates this most clearly. She can enjoy herself. She can share feelings and memories with others. She can muse and contemplate the world and the, at best, mixed legacy of her own family as well as Zuko. And yet, ultimately, people do not trust her, and she does not trust them. She has the capacity to have these reflections, but ultimately, her view of the world, her experience of the world, is undergirded by this rather coldly mechanistic view of the world. Where people are inevitably pursuing their wild, selfish passions, and these passions inevitably conflict, and one has to connive and scheme in order to secure one's own best interests. It's a rather sad and rather desolate mental state. As much as I've heard people call her Nietzschean, that's a really narrow misunderstanding of Nietzsche. Again, the will to power does not mean the will or the desire even to establish power over others. Nietzsche actually says something really interesting, and I agree with Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition that it would have been beneficial if he had followed up on this a bit, but it's still an interesting comment about how society is basically founded on promises, on the capacity to maintain and keep those promises. Before, in pre-civilization for Nietzsche, in people's more animalistic state, everyone was simply subject to the caprices of the natural world and could not really exert a sufficient degree of control over their natural environment to create the conditions where promises have any weight. But in civilization, where there is a degree of control over the environment, over one's circumstances vested in the individual, that is when promises become possible. One can say, even something as simple as, we are going to have a party tonight, like we see in the beach. We're going to have this big party and everyone is going to attend. And through a mix of reason and willpower, you make that happen. You create this environment, this party environment, and everyone comes and has a good time. It is a conception of relationships, a conception of society that's fundamentally founded on action, on behavior, on being able to guarantee, at least to the best of your abilities, that a certain thing will happen, not just for the benefit of yourself, but for the benefit of others, and so guarantee a kind of common good. Azula is capable of doing that, but she is ultimately unwilling. She only works for her own benefit. And her benefit as conceived of as innately opposed to others. Azula ultimately has a kind of philosophical vacuity to her, an emptiness. She's very good at scheming, she's very good at planning and thinking about how to dominate other people, but she is not good at thinking about why. What drives her? What viewpoints? What ideologies impel her to do what she does? Zuko, even at his worst, is always thinking. Sometimes he's thinking too much. He's constantly anxious. Azula never thinks about the world in these philosophical terms. She merely pursues her own grasping self-interest to increase her power and control. And so she is always alone. Always really alone. She has no bonds that she can really rely upon. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can. Do you want to see more videos like this before anyone else? Keep watching Avatar. It's a brilliant show. And read that Azula graphic novel if you haven't. It's quite good. Adios, comrades.